We have almost made it through winter. Now, it might not look it, especially where I'm at right now, but winter is coming to an end here soon. And when looking back into the ancient past and the holidays that they celebrated and the goddesses or the gods that they venerated, we can see some reflections, in particular in the Celts, about the early signs of spring. Now, I've been researching paganism, ancient mythologies, and beliefs for years now, and so I've known about Imbolc or Brigid for a really long time. But this is the first time I've ever done any actual research. And so like many of my videos, we're going to try to break this down into the ancient history of what we know from the ancient past, what was done during Christianization, and then the things added within the New Age, and ultimately what this means for you. And I hope you appreciate this video because it is 7 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly negative 11 Celsius. It's bloody cold out here. But with that, let's go ahead and begin this discussion on Brigid, the goddess and saint of the early spring. Now, I may have said the goddess of early spring, but Brigid has many different aspects. And I think this is probably where I can share with you why it is so complicated to look into Brigid and why it actually might be a detriment to her at the same time, that she has so many aspects that have been seen from the ancient past, but also have been added on in recent years. Let me explain with a beautiful backdrop of green and warm, well, sometimes warm Ireland. Let's go ahead and just list out, starting with the basics, of the many aspects of Brigid. So first off, she is notably the goddess of fire and water. Cool, not too bad. She's also often listed as a goddess of smithing and crafts. Okay, that's not too different than what fire already is. She's also tied very heavily to animals and abundance, namely products such as milk. All right, that's not so bad. Milk's good. But additionally, she's also tied to sacred springs and their healing properties. All right, well, that's still tied to water. We're not too far off. But then she is also noted as a goddess of war. Now, that's a big change from milk, water, and fire. But we're going to talk about the goddess of war later on. When we look at her mythological element, she is listed as a daughter of the Dagda, as well as a lover of the Dagda. Now, that's a little bit more awkward of a shift. She's also listed as possibly 3 different sisters, all named Brigid, all with 3 different aspects. And we haven't even gotten to the fact that she is also tied to creativity, as she is also listed as a goddess of the bards, poets, and other creative types. She's also heavily tied to the mythos of the Druids, and thought to be one of the primary goddesses worshipped by the Druids, if not being a Druid herself. And all of this is not just from one religious understanding. She is revered in ancient pagan customs across Ireland, New Age practices in Wicca. She is idolized as a saint for over 1,500 years in Ireland. She's also tied to, of course, Imbolc and then of St. Brigid's Day and the coming of spring, and possibly even a dual-faced deity comparatively to the Cailleach when it comes to the winter goddess. And so you have all of this tied to just one name. It's made me feel a little bit like Charlie Kelly trying to put together who Pepe Sylvia is. Meanwhile, I'm over here just smoking a cigarette thinking, who in the world is Brigid? But luckily, let's take a breath and bring this all together and look at this beautiful field of Ireland, because she is also tied to Ireland itself and the land and abundance and all of this. And ultimately, researching this away from Ireland, it can be very difficult to understand Brigid because she is so heavily tied to the land of Ireland, much like all of Celtic and Irish beliefs. But with that, let's go ahead and return to this cold and winter day and discuss a little bit more of Brigid and how she survived in the ancient myths. So hopefully you're starting to see what I mean when I say she's complicated. But the way I digest mythology, now keep in mind, I am not a scholar by any means. I would be, at best, what you would quantify as an independent researcher of ancient religions. But I have been researching these beliefs for a very long time. And the way I typically go about them is I do look at what we know from the far, far past as far as written source materials, any artifacts that survive, and then I build up from there. Because I think this is a really good practice because there is a lot of New Age fluff around a lot of these subject materials, in particular when it comes to the Celtic. This is something that I mentioned when I first started talking about Celtic paganism in belief, is that you have, I think I described it as like an old cake or a pie that has a lot of different like toppings on top, like this New Age fluff, like whipped cream of New Age. And so I like to scrape all that away and see, okay, what do we know from the ancient past? And then we start looking at the New Age stuff that's been put on top. Now, I'm not saying that New Age stuff is inherently bad, but it can make it really confusing to look at these subject materials. Now, we can also see that as researchers and scholars started writing about Bridget and recording about her, there's a lot of assumptions that have been made. And there's very little hard, concrete stuff on one singular Bridget. And this is an important thing to note here, is that there more than likely was not one Bridget in Irish history. In fact, it seems like Bridget and the term Brige or Brig is something that was a title to some degree. And I've even seen it mentioned by certain scholars that Bridget may have been a combination of multiple goddesses. In fact, this is probably true for a lot of the Celtic beliefs, is a lot of the gods that we know and survive today are a combination of many. And just like with the winter hag goddess, the Cailleach, it's very similar in the sense that there are multiple versions of the Cailleach, and there are more than likely multiple versions of Bridget as well. And this is mostly mentioned when it comes to Brigantia, and this seems another combination of those things. Like I mentioned, the war goddess aspect seems to be kind of out of place compared to the other ones. And as I was reading in the main book I was kind of researching from, which is just a book called Brigid, is Brigantia was a Britannic deity, so a goddess coming from Britain. And the theory is that as the British Celts were being pushed out by the Romans, and then of course by Christianity as well, they were starting to migrate over into Ireland. And that as they migrated, they brought this goddess Brigantia with them. Now, Brigantia was much more of a war goddess. Now, we have very little surviving about Brigantia, besides a few sculptures of loose mentioning, but it seems like she had a war goddess aspect. And so the theory is that this Brigantia, who is obviously a related deity to Bridget, came over from Britain and then brought the war goddess aspect with her as well. Now, another theory with this is that Brigantia was also tied to smithing, and this is also why smithing was brought over with Bridget as well. Because within the Irish belief, you already have a smithing god in Goibniu. When talking about smithing with Bridget, it's not like she is the actual goddess of the hammering smith. From what I've seen, and the best reference is that she is more the spark of the fire, the spark of creativity, the flame that heats the metal, or the water that quenches the blade. And so this is more the spirit of Bridget. And again, it could be because of this migration of deities, is that the people of Britain were bringing Brigantia as a smithing goddess to a country that already had a smithing god. And so as those beliefs came together, they merged into something different. And of course, we have to mention the fact that this is coming from a wide span of history when it comes to talking about the migrations of the Celtic peoples, particularly when it comes to Ireland, a country built of immigrations and invasions. And so when we're talking about Bridget and Irish history and Irish culture, belief, mythology, and Celtic belief and mythology, we're talking about so many different layers of history, and we're only getting that topmost layer that has been heavily eroded. And that's what makes it so difficult to talk about, but also so fascinating to research. And so as we continue on into the discussion of Bridget, just keep in mind that I don't know 100% the truth, and I'm definitely going to mispronounce things. And I know people are still going to put that in the comments. And I try my best, to learn, just understand that obviously I'm coming as an American perspective, a well-traveled one, I think, at this point. And I try to do my research the best I can, but I can't always pronounce everything correctly, especially when it comes to the Irish. So with that, let's dive a little bit more deeper into the Irish history and the identity of Bridget, especially when it comes to how she survives within written myth from the Irish monks as they recorded them after conversion. The most notable story of Bridget and how she survives in the ancient myths is the Second Battle of Mag Tuirig. Bridget was married off to a king named Bres. Now, Bres was not necessarily liked, but she did have a son with him named Rudan. Rudan is mortally wounded during a battle, and Bridget laments over his body and is said to have introduced the practice of keening, or kinging? A tradition of wailing over the dead in Ireland. In the same story, she is also credited with inventing a whistle that allows communication during night travel, enhancing safety and coordination after nightfall. In the Book of the Taking of Ireland, Bridget is said to be the owner of 2 oxen, a Fia and Femin, as well as a boar named Torc Triath. These animals are quite significant to Ireland, and many things are actually named after them. And these animals were said to cry whenever there was plundering committed over Ireland, most notably probably by the Vikings, suggesting that Bridget had a role over the guardianship of Ireland as well as over domesticated animals. Within Cormac's glossary, a 9th century manuscript, this is where we get the triple goddess aspect of Bridget, where she is described as Bridget the poet, Bridget the healer, as well as Bridget the smith. So there are a few surviving stories about Bridget that give us a slight look into who she possibly would have been. Now, as we said before, more than likely Bridget is a combination of multiple goddesses coming together, but also the title of Brig or Brige may have been added to individuals who actually lived, which eventually led into the sainthood of Bridget. Let me explain that a little further. So, Bridget, as it is translated into English, actually just roughly means the exalted one. And so someone with the title of Brig or Brige may have just been someone who was an exalted person or a person of high spiritual ranking, particularly when it came to women. And this is when sainthood kind of comes into play, because within the Catholic story of Saint Bridget, there was a person named Bridget who supposedly performed these different miracles and led to the starting of basically the cult of Saint Bridget. And so do I believe that the goddess Bridget was around at the time of conversion that led her to becoming Saint Bridget? No, but I believe that there was a person with the title of Bridget or Brige that was leading to these things. Which again, this could lead to the multiple different aspects that somewhat don't have to do with one another, is that we're talking about individuals with the title of Bridge or Brige that would have led them to eventually being combined into the legend. Now, this is probably a good time to start talking about her sainthood, because this is an important part of her story and where we get a lot of the surviving source material about Bridget as a goddess. And so, roughly at the time of conversion of the Irish people, St. Bridget was a very early canonized figure. And this is where a lot of the stories that survive and aspects that we know about Bridget still survive today. And this is also where St. Bridget's feast day comes from, which is ultimately the reason we know that Imbolc existed, or at least possibly existed at the same time, being January 31st to February 1st. Now, there's a lot of local myth and folklore around St. Bridget's Day and why this day is the important one. Much like Groundhog Day in the U.S., early February, even though it can still often be cold and covered in snow, this is usually in at least the northern hemisphere, around the Irish area, and even here in the United States, that you start seeing the early signs of spring. That be it, still small signs of spring. In particular, when it comes to Bridget and St. Bridget, we see a lot of the aspects of farm life and cattle and livestock, because St. Bridget's Day is also at the same time that cattle would begin to go out and produce milk once more. And so a lot of the stories around St. Bridget revolve around her stories involving animals. Now, one of the more important aspects of St. Bridget is certainly the one of her eternal flame. Now, this is definitely one that sparks some form of debate whether or not this was pagan in origin, but it definitely seems something that wasn't necessarily Catholic. Now, St. Bridget's main place of veneration is in Leinster in Kildare, and so she has a main church there where she was venerated, and there for nearly 1,500 years, if not 1,500 years plus, there was an eternal flame to St. Bridget that was maintained by an order called the Brigadine Sisters, which still does exist today. Now, as far as I can tell, the eternal flame no longer exists, and there is a monument to it in Kildare, but for 1,500 years-ish, there was an eternal flame to Bridget that was burning in Ireland. And supposedly this eternal flame was something that was kept for a long time prior to the Catholic conversion of Ireland. Now, this is a really powerful aspect to think that possibly, let alone for 1,500 years this eternal flame was maintained, and then you have an eternal flame that possibly was existing even longer into the Celtic era. And I think this is where the big aspect of Bridget's connection to flames comes from, especially when it comes to smithing and the eternal flame and how it was maintained by the Irish Catholic Church. Now, of course, there are a few other stories and different things that come into Bridget and her aspects into Catholicism. And so I want to share with you some of those stories and see some of those magical aspects, because you can definitely tell that these stories come from a much more ancient time than just one individual during the time of conversion. Now, when looking at the actual stories of Saint Bridget and how she survives within Catholicism, we get a few different accounts. Most notably, from a young age, it was said that Bridget, who became Saint Bridget, was very generous and charitable towards people and those who were cast out of society, such as lepers. But one of the most notable stories and one of the most magical ones is when it comes to the miracle of the cloak, where Bridget is seeking to attain land in order to build her convent of nuns. When she approaches the king of Leinster, he jokingly agrees to give her as much land as her cloak can cover. And so then her cloak magically spans a huge span of area, and then the king has to give it to her. And so this cloak is like a magic cloak, and the king grants her land, leading to her monastery being built in Kildare. There's also a story of her, which I'm sure the Irish absolutely love, where she is able to transform water into beer, performing some kind of miracle. Now, this is probably the most important miracle in Ireland, considering that beer is basically water. Now, there's also a story about how Bridget is able to heal others very miraculously outside of just the healing wells named after her. And that so much so that her own blood is actually even able to heal people. There's a story of two twins that are mute, and that the blood from her head is actually able to heal their muteness. Again, this is sounding a little pagan to me, but who am I but just a man talking about ancient stories? And then, of course, there's a lot of different stories about how Bridget is connected to women, and this is also a story throughout her history, is the story of her connection to nuns and sisters, but also to advocating for women's rights. And so as her story developed throughout history, she became more tied to feminism and a feminist icon of early and modern Ireland. Now, I should definitely say that as I was doing this research and definitely looking into Celtic Catholicism, Irish Catholicism, it's quite a bit different than the Roman Catholic to some degree. And I really think that a lot more of the pagan customs survived within Irish Catholicism than they did in the Roman. And I think St. Bridget is a really great example of that. And especially since that her order still worships and venerates her today, roughly to the same degree that they did in the ancient past, at least as far as we can tell, I think is a really important thing. Now, I know I was reading some articles online about how St. Bridget and St. Bridget's Day is starting to get recognized, or is recognized in Ireland as Imbolc, as a neo-pagan holiday, as a way to honor the past, and how this has great gains. But I've also seen a lot of counteractive articles saying that this is kind of a tarnishing of Irish culture because of how long St. Bridget has been honored in the modern era. And this is an interesting point, because even though we call her St. Bridget now, or the Irish call her St. Bridget now, does it take away from the fact that you're venerating the same being? This is an interesting ethical thing. And so I want to know your thoughts down below. If someone is worshiping Bridget as a goddess, and someone who is worshiping Bridget as a saint, are they ultimately worshiping the same thing in the end, or are they worshiping two different things? In my mind, I think that they're worshiping the same thing. And so whether you call her Saint Bridget or just Bridget the goddess, I think you're ultimately getting to the same thing here. And I think you can still feel those things, and particularly when it comes to healing wells, which is another very big aspect of St. Bridget as she survives today in ancient Ireland, or in modern Ireland, is these wells that are scattered around Ireland that you can still visit today, tied to healing aspects, and many of them being tied to Bridget. More than likely, these wells were tied to Bridget the goddess before they were tied to St. Bridget, much like many of the wells across Europe. They were originally tied to healing beings such as Sulis Minerva, or different grottos in Germany that I've been to. But ultimately, yeah, these wells, they're healing. They're a place of peace. And whether you call that St. Bridget's Well or Bridget's Well, or so have you, does it really matter at the end of the day, or is it about the healing waters? So let me know your thoughts down below. It's definitely something I've been thinking about, is does it ultimately matter how we call these things or how we recognize these things, if ultimately it's about what they do for us? And, just like the White Springs in Glastonbury, a place I really love, there's people that go there as Catholics, there's people that go there as pagans, there's people that go there as Hindus, and we all recognize the healing power of that place. And I do know that the current keeper of the well is a devotee to Bridget as well. So yeah, there's a lot to think about here and lots to unpack, but I hope you're enjoying the conversation. And ultimately, again, the reason I like talking about these things isn't to get into these arguments about who's right and who's wrong. I just find this stuff fascinating, and I find Bridget fascinating, and genuinely I enjoy just talking about these things, so I hope you enjoy listening about them. Hey, this is a great time to mention, if you want to think about supporting this channel, think about purchasing a copy of the Glastonbury Tourist, available now on Amazon. Oh, okay. I also have a book called A Yule Story. I hope you check it out as well. They're all a lot of fun. Oh my gosh. Woo. That was a lot of fun. Oh, it's bumpier this time. Oh gosh. As with much of the Irish and Celtic stuff we talk about here, and something I've talked about before, is with the coming of modern Wicca, the Celtic gods and goddesses were heavily wrapped into it in the very beginning. And Bridget is no exception here. And so it can be very difficult to look into Bridget without coming across a lot of different New Age material. With some benefit, I think, my philosophy on paganism and ancient religions in general is that they need to grow, they need to evolve into their own new thing. But I don't think we're honest enough about where the ancient source material ends and the modern neo-paganism begins. And when it comes to Wicca, there definitely, I think, was not a lot of care about that, at least in the beginning. I think there's more now, but it can be very difficult to kind of separate those two things. So for me, after doing this research and boiling down, okay, the essence of what Bridget was in the past, and then looking at these neo-pagan things that have been added by the many, many books. I mean, there are so many books written about Bridget. It's kind of crazy. So many modern priestesses of Bridget. It seems like that she's been being worshipped as a modern goddess again, probably for well over 100 years. And so this is a long amount of time, and a lot of time for people to add their voice to Bridget's story. But ultimately, isn't that what I'm doing here? And that's the thing, as I think we just have to be honest, like I'm trying to be in this video, about what we know and about what we're adding. Now, luckily, I don't have many modern examples of myself honoring Celtic deities. It's just not something I feel connected to. But there are aspects to Bridget that I think I recognize and I have experienced myself. Now, there is typically the three aspects: the smithing, the poetry, and then also the healing aspect. These are the main ones often mentioned. But I think you can boil these down into two main elements. The two main elements I think Bridget are tied to, at least in my research and understanding, and that is fire and water. She exists within these two things. The water aspect is the healing aspect, is the one that helps, is the one that is also tied to the land. She is seen as the land goddess, and so the water of the land that feeds the livestock in order for them to produce milk, in order for them to be healthy and to grow. And so I do think that she is tied to the waters, the sacred waters of life. And water is healing. We take it for granted now because we can turn our water to heat and bathe our bodies, but we all know what it feels like to not bathe for a few days. We feel gross, we feel sticky, we feel unwell. And so we have a great privilege of water, the majority of us these days. But in the ancient past, this was not so. And so having clean water to bathe oneself in was a healing thing. And so I think Bridget is sacred healing water, and then also the water of the earth that gives us food in abundance. And then there's also the aspect of fire, but not just the eternal flame. Obviously, this is an aspect, so fire keeping and maintaining a sacred fire, which is very important in pagan circles and indigenous circles, is treating fire with respect and recognizing again that we live a privileged life and existence, that we don't have to think about fire as much as we used to. But fire used to be, I mean, still is, the aspect of warmth, community, of food, of cooking, of cleansing, of healing. Fire, sacred fire, so very important. But then also that aspect of smithing, as I've seen in that research and discussion, is that she isn't the actual hammer hitting the steel. She is the fire that feeds the flame. She is the spark that ignites it at the first time. She is the heat that tempers the metal. She is the water that quenches it. And so these two things coming together. And then also there's the poetry aspect, which I haven't talked about as much in this video because there isn't as much surviving source material, I think. But her aspect of creativity, of poetry, is very big into her. Especially when it comes to the bards and the singers of the ancient days. But I would argue that she still fits into that flame, that spark, the spark of creativity. So yeah, I think she's that initial ideal, the initial inspiration, the initial aha moment. These are what I observed. So obviously I can be wrong, you can have a differing opinion. But after reflecting on it, meditating on her and reflecting on this video, these things make sense. Sacred fire, sacred, inspiration, and water, sacred water, and healing. These things coming together. And I feel really good about that. I feel really connected to that idea. Perhaps it's not Bridget, perhaps it's just me being connected to this idea. But when looking back on my own healing journey and seeing the importance of water and fire and how much they've taught me, how much they've healed me, I do feel tingles of what could be a connection to Bridget through these elements, and obviously observing and acknowledging these sacred powers within my ritual and ceremony life, I think would make me feel more connected to Bridget as well. But I think I'm just a rambling person on a freezing stone at this moment, so I think I'm going to go get some warmth. And I appreciate you watching this video, and as always, I want to hear your thoughts down below, because that is so very important to me. And it's so very important for me to share with you that I don't have the only thought, theory, opinion, or truth in this world. I am just someone on YouTube sharing my thoughts with you and hoping that they inspire you, and also understanding that this research is hard when it comes to a lot of these ancient source materials. I find it interesting, but I also, again, am not perfect. And so I want to hear your thoughts down below, anything you think I should look deeper into, But ultimately, I do think that Bridget is a very interesting, powerful goddess and deity. And of all the beings when it comes to the Celtic world that I've researched and looked into, this is the first one I genuinely feel like I understand and genuinely feel like I've had a connection to just through that aspect of sacred water and sacred flame. So, thank you so much for joining me for this video, and I hope you join me for future videos discussing all things in the ancient world and how they still survive today.